Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. We're jumping into part 2 of this intense story, so make sure you're all caught up. Let's get started. It's already been 4 days since Elena's incident with Incan Marson, and she's been stuck with a doctor who keeps asking her the same questions every morning. Elena, filled with frustration, asks the doctor if he isn't tired. Instead, he advises Elena not to be relieved because even if she doesn't appear to have any symptoms at that time, they never can tell when or how some sequel will appear, but Elena is unbothered. Is it because I've already died once? Elena questions. She smiles as she thinks, I could not forget the face of my husband who forgot to put on a mask. Noticing the bruise on Elena's neck, the doctor pauses and inquires about it, but Elena assures him that it's no longer as painful as before. Before leaving, the doctor instructs a maid to bring in some medicine, making sure Elena takes it before he departs. Later, the Duke comes to visit Elena. He has some peaches with him, and as he skillfully peels them, Elena wonders if his sword skills have anything to do with his skills at peeling fruits. The Duke offers her a slice, and when she asks if he's also going to be there with fruits the next day, he says yes. She asks him what kind he would bring, and he asks if there's anyone she'd like to eat specially, but she tells him she'll leave it to him. But wait, it gets better. As she reaches for another slice, the Duke stops her. He casually wipes a bit of peach juice from the side of her mouth with his finger. In a new scene, Elena inquires about Incan's body from Ben, and he confirms that the body had indeed disappeared. Incan was instantly killed by the Duke's sword, and his body retrieved by the Duke's troops. Since then, opinions have been scattered regarding the disposition of the body for a while, but it was finally decided 2 days ago that he would be sent to the royal castle for trial even though he's already dead. It would mean killing him twice, and everyone had agreed on it because it could officially reveal Incan's guilt. But something strange had happened the day before. A truck carrying Incan's body and a witness had left headed to the royal castle, and they mentioned that the body was no longer there. Are you saying the body was stolen? Elena asks, but Ben tells her that there was a witness who'd seen the body disappear in person. According to the witness, the body that had been intact suddenly melted before their eyes, and when Elena suggests that the witness might have been drunk, he tells her it was strange that even his clothes still remained there. He tells Elena that there were assumptions circulating around the people carrying the corpse on whether he'd studied black magic while he was alive. Dark magic, a magic that uses terrible forms of human sacrifice. Even learning it itself was an abomination, but even that magic no longer existed. Ben further explains to Elena that there's a saying, black magic goes against the will of God, so therefore after death they can no longer return to God and their own body is erased. Elena asks if he really believes that, but he tells her he thinks it would be easier to give an answer after the investigation is carried out. Alone in the room, Elena can't help but question if Incan had really practiced black magic, thinking he was definitely suspicious. Suddenly she begins to recall the stench of unknown causes that he expelled, his hands that became black as he wrapped it around her neck, which didn't seem new to him. Incan was seriously injured when he encountered that monster, and his recovery was extraordinarily fast. If all of that wasn't the power of black magic, so what was it? Elena wonders. Elena still tries to figure out how she'd gotten the light that issued from her hand that day, when Anna comes in with news that the Duke has sent a proposal that they have dinner together that night. In a new scene, a lady stands in front of a window welcoming a bird. She takes the paper from its foot and afterwards pours a strange liquid onto it which reveals the writings. There is no evidence. The body has been removed. The lady reveals to be Incan's sister, who reflects on how she'd ordered her knight to kill Incan once he reaches him, but if he isn't alone his companions should be killed first, and it should appear as though Incan had unalived himself. However, if you fail to reach Incan and he dies in someone else's hand, use what I gave you to get rid of his body, she concluded. Despite having prepared for the worst-case scenario, Rebecca still couldn't believe it had come to that. She contemplates her next move, confident that Incan wouldn't have revealed anything since she had spent years brainwashing him. However, Rebecca grows concerned that the Duchess might have picked up on something suspicious. Realizing that even the smallest detail could expose her, she resolves to remain vigilant. As she walks, her maid approaches and inquires about what to do with the black dress she had recently acquired. She coldly instructs her to discard it, remembering how she had intended to mourn Incan at his funeral, After he was supposedly killed by bandits, however, her plan had failed, and the dress was no longer of any use. After some thought, she changes her mind and instructs the maid to keep the black dress since there's might be a chance when it'll come in handy. In the next scene, Lady Rebecca's father is furious, shouting at her for forbidding Incan from ever leaving the estate. He blames her, saying that none of this would have happened if she hadn't confined him. He continues, suggesting that Incan probably acted out because he felt trapped. Rebecca tries to calm him down, but her father grows even more anxious, worrying that the Duke would do something since he might believe they were complicit in the situation all along. Her father tells her the Duke will surely use it against them, and it's not the same as the issue with the maids like before, but Rebecca only tells him that the Duke will force others to cut off all trades with them, and there's nothing they can do if he decides to sabotage their distribution channels. He has more than enough money to do it. I didn't work so hard just to see my house go down at the hands of that monster. This is all your fault, her father exclaims. Frustrated by her father's relentless complaints, Rebecca snaps at her father to be quiet. You're so loud that it's giving me a headache, so will please stop yapping and shut your mouth, father? Rebecca exclaims. Her statement only irritates her father further that he approaches questioning if she just said that to him, but a red smoke that emits her pendant leaves her father dazed. You will stay quiet, won't you, father? She asks, to which he responds yes. As he returns to his seat, she tells him she'll make sure the Duke doesn't think they're involved. I'll need to handle some urgent matters for now, and as for the Duchess, I'll wait for a good opportunity to get rid of her, Rebecca concludes. In the Mayhart Duchy, Elena sits with a pen and paper wondering why her family hadn't sent a reply to her letters. She reflects on how she'd written 2 letters after the incident, one to her friend Rosalind and the other to her family in the capital. She'd gotten a reply from Max's manor the same day, but it only stated that her friend wouldn't be able to respond since she was away at the moment. I know my family manor is far away, but it would only take a day for a well-trained pigeon to get here. So why is it taking so long? Elena questions. She abandons that thought and ponders on whether to ask the Duke to the lake, but recalling how she hadn't been able to go for a walk recently, she decides to think it over. Besides, there's no need anymore, Elena thinks as she smiles, recalling how the Duke had confessed that he needed her. He told me that he needs me. In a new scene, Elena decides to go for a walk around the castle. Once she gets out, 2 guards come to her and explain that they would be in charge of escorting her on her walk. Elena notices Sir Colin isn't with them, so she asks about him, and they reveal that he's been training very hard on the field, giving everything to be stronger. Later, Elena runs into Mina, a maid who was also attacked by Incan's men. She also expresses her worry for Sir Colin, leaving Elena confused. The maid continues and says she couldn't help but worry hearing that Sir Colin's face is far from being well soon. Elena immediately turns to the guards who'd lied about Sir Colin's situation, and they apologize to her, saying they couldn't have said anything since they'd received orders. She inquires about his condition, and after some questioning, they reveal that Sir Colin had done it to himself. In a new scene, the Duke pays another visit to Elena, quickly sensing that something is troubling her. She reveals her concern about Sir Colin's face, explaining that Ben had informed her that Sir Colin harmed himself while she was unconscious, right outside her room. The Duke asks if she cares about it, to which she responds emphatically, of course. She expresses her confusion over why Sir Colin would make such a choice, speculating that he must feel an overwhelming sense of guilt, despite the fact that she never blamed him for the situation. Kaihin, she pleads, what can I do about it? Elena asks if the Duke thinks Sir Colin would stop blaming himself if she told him it wasn't his fault. However, the Duke suggests it might be more effective for her to punish him instead. She insists that Sir Colin isn't to blame, but he explains that Sir Colin feels otherwise. I think if you punish him, he may feel better and could be more cautious in the future, the Duke replies. The Duke leans in closer to Elena, whispering a new idea into her ear, and as she listens, a smile spreads across her face, and she asks, do you really think that will work? In a new scene, Sir Colin enters Elena's presence, and she asks if he knows why he has been summoned. He answers that he deserves punishment for his insolence the previous day, but Elena clarifies that isn't the reason for his summons. She reminds him that he was assigned to be her guard and that he failed to protect her. He acknowledges this, and she states firmly that he is accountable for his mistakes. Your punishment begins now. You will be my personal guard for the next 6 months, but you won't receive any salary for it, she declares. Sir Colin's eyes widen as he processes this. He quickly asks if it meant he's been given another chance, quickly adding that he doesn't deserve it, but Elena interrupts, making it clear that this is not a chance, but a punishment. Sir Colin, this is a consequence for your actions. You're serving a sentence. Does unpaid labor sound like a joke to you? She continues. She assures him that after 6 months of hard work without pay, he will likely change his perspective. Besides, you don't have a choice. Criminals don't get to decide their sentences, do they? As Elena observes, she wonders if her plan had worked. Reflecting on how the Duke had suggested, she give him an ambiguous punishment that feels like a reward and just insists that it's a punishment. To Elena's surprise, Sir Colin begins to shed tears. He genuinely thanks her for giving him another opportunity, even though he isn't fit to serve her. He tells her he'll do his best to protect her with his life, reflecting on how the whole incident was his fault since he was the one who'd suggested they go into town. He reflects on how suffocating the guilt had, almost like it was strangling him by the neck, so he punched his face to punish himself, and though the pain briefly made him feel better, it didn't last. The previous day, he'd run away from the Duchess at the training grounds mostly because he couldn't bear to look at the scarf, hiding her bruise, and yet she'd given him another chance. As Elena strolls down the hallway, she overhears the other knights voicing their protests, claiming that Sir Colin has received a reward instead of punishment. Curious, she approaches them and asks what's going on, and they respond that they want the same reward he supposedly received. In a new scene, Elena learns from Ben about the butler of House Marson, who has reportedly taken his own life. Ben explains that Incan had secretly practiced black magic for a long time, and his sister discovered his dark activities a few years ago. Since then, Incan had been oppressive towards her, a situation the butler witnessed but chose to keep quiet about to protect House Marson's reputation. However, following Incan's death, his sister revealed the abuse she endured, and on the same day, the butler was found dead in his home, along with a letter. Ben continues, informing Elena that they have uncovered evidence of Incan's black magic practice, an ancient dark magic book that cannot be obtained through ordinary means, which serves as sufficient proof of his guilt. Curious about the family's response, Elena asks how Viscount Marson is handling the situation. Ben tells her that the Viscount claimed that Incan had acted alone, and he also promised to send gifts of apology to the duchy as a gesture of goodwill. Additionally, Ben mentions that a formal request has been sent to the royal court to have Incan's name removed from the family tree. Ben updates Elena about the herb distribution center, informing her that the trial run will commence several days earlier than anticipated. He mentions that since Anna played a significant role in her rescue, he doesn't think anyone will object to her being the manager of the center. However, Elena declines to call Anna to the castle, saying, "Go and handle other things. As for me, I'm going to see my guest." Elena then visits Master Sidron, who inquires about her well-being. She notices he has a kind if dull look on his face, so she asks if he's unwell, but he replies that he just didn't get enough sleep. She tells him she wanted to thank him for casting the tracking spell on her earring, but he insists there's no need, claiming the spell wasn't effective since he had to cast it on the spot. He opens a box containing several magical artifacts, explaining that he's imbued them with spells for attack, defense, teleportation, and communication. These artifacts are designed to respond to the voice of their first wearer, and he promises to leave a manual with activation phrases and detailed explanations for each one. Curious, Elena calls out, "Lord of the Black Tower, did you stay up all night making these?" However, Sidron's silence prompts her to question why he would go to such lengths. She reveals that she looked into his background and discovered in the process that he's notorious for having a nasty personality, even earning him the nickname Dirtbag. Why does someone so ill-tempered act meek as a lamb around me and do everything I ask without question? Elena asks. "You didn't even sleep to make these for me, so tell me," she insists. She probes further, asking, "Is it because you admire my husband?" Requesting honesty, she adds, "You really don't care if I get hurt, but you know my husband will worry if I'm in danger, and that's why you made these." In response, Sidron asks why she would think that, suggesting he could simply be doing it for her sake. Elena, however, urges him not to be ridiculous. Do you take me for a fool? Elena asks as she reveals that she has an eye for people. You're not interested in me as a person, but you're interested in me as Kiffin's wife. Sidron finally drops his axe, and she asks why he likes the Duke so much, and she was aware that they were both close friends, but his dedication to the Duke was way beyond that. Kiffin told me Sidron used to be a priest, but not anymore, and they happened to meet by chance, and became best friends ever since, but that doesn't explain the unwavering dedication Sidron shows to Kiffin. Elena asks how they'd become close friends, and he explains that long ago he'd helped him with something. He'd help him quit being a priest. Elena asks if perhaps he'd needed help to quit, but he says no, he didn't. Sensing that the conversation could lead to a somber story, Elena decides not to pry into Sidron's past any further. She thanks him for the artifacts, but just as he's about to leave, she inquires about his knowledge of black magic. Sidron asks what she wants to know, mentioning that he might have more insight than most. Elena wonders if dark mages emit a foul stench, and Sidron admits he's not certain, as he hasn't heard anything specific about that. However, he offers a plausible explanation, explaining that some forms of black magic require practitioners to keep corpses nearby, and in some cases, decaying ones. He elaborates that these corpses must be kept for up to 15 days, which could explain any lingering rotten stench that doesn't wash off. Lastly, Elena asks if there are any types of magic that are incompatible with dark magic, something that can completely neutralize the power of a dark mage by simply touching him. Sidron tells her there's no magic of the sort, and before she leaves she asks how he finds the time to work when he responds to all her summons right away, but he responds that he doesn't work, and instead he has people do the work for him. Later, Elena sits in the dining hall with the Duke, a grin on her face as she recounts her visit from the Master of the Black Tower. The Duke mentions he's heard about the artifacts Sidron gifted her, and Elena shares how delighted she is by the unexpected presents. Just as she smiles, thinking of how even the Duke's closest friend had sensed his concern for her, the atmosphere shifts when the Duke breaks the silence with a hint of jealousy, asking, "So you're happy because of Sidron, am I right?" The Duke's eyes betray his feelings as he looks away, accidentally cracking the plate when he reaches for a piece of meat. Startled, Elena asks if he's all right, but he brushes it off, claiming there must have been a crack in the plate. Later, in her room, Elena sits in awe as she surveys the pile of gifts sent by the Duke. The maid interrupts her thoughts to deliver a letter. Curious, Elena opens it to find a message that reads, "You haven't forgotten me, have you?" She tries to guess who it could be when the doctor calls her attention, and she eagerly asks if that means she can now go for walks and no longer has to sleep alone. The doctor confirms she can. That night, as she lies beside the Duke, he inquires about her outing. Elena tells him it was great and shares that she doesn't know what Ben did, but he has transformed Anna into a heroine. Now even the kids who once threw rocks at her bring her food. After observing the Duke for a moment, Elena gathers her courage to ask if he has been very busy lately. He denies it, but she presses on, reminding him that she's heard everything. He spends all day in the office except for meal times. The Duke downplays it, saying it's nothing serious and that things will return to normal once he sorts it out. Elena suggests they resume his painting lessons once he's finished with his work, adding, "And let's go boating together once you're not so busy." She asks if he's tried it before, but the Duke says no, and immediately she gets excited that will be another thing he'd get to try first with her. They say goodnight to each other, but later she calls the Duke and asks if he'd like to go on a walk with her. As they walk through the garden, Elena trips, but the Duke catches her. The garden is darker than it seems at night. The Duke continues as he extends his hand, hinting that they hold hands through their walk in the garden. The Duke notices that Elena seems to be having trouble falling asleep. When he asks her about it, she replies that it's just one of those days, insisting she usually sleeps well. He probes further, wondering if something is bothering her, but she reassures him that it isn't the case. Elena admits, however, that sometimes he makes her feel like a fragile glass doll, acting as if even the slightest inconvenience could shatter her. Just then, a leaf falls onto her head, and as the Duke gently brushes it away, and an idea sparks in her mind. As they lie in bed, Elena shares a memory of how her nanny used to read her old fairy tales whenever she struggled to sleep, eventually lulling her into slumber. Now that she's older, she admits she's not interested in fairy tales anymore. Instead, she wants to hear the Duke's stories, perhaps about how he slayed monsters or rescued Anna and Hans. The Duke hesitates, claiming his stories wouldn't be entertaining, but Elena insists she doesn't mind. In fact, she muses that she might fall asleep faster if the stories are unexciting. Reluctantly, the Duke gives in and begins to share his tales. As she listens, Elena's eyelids begin to grow heavy, and she eventually drifts off to sleep. While adjusting the blanket around her, the Duke thinks to himself, "I've never had someone so tiny and delicate by my side. I must be careful with everything I do, because I never want to hurt you." The next morning, the Duke sends for Ben, instructing him to speed up the acquisition of the merchant group they discussed the day before, even if it means stretching the budget. He also tells Ben to ensure the maids don't wake the Duchess today. In a new scene, Elena wakes up feeling more refreshed than ever. As she stretches, she reflects on how exciting the Duke's story was and thinks about asking him to share more that night. Moments later, Ben enters and informs her that she has some visitors. Curious, Elena goes out to find Mary, but before she can ask how she arrived, she hears her brother calling her. "I came all the way here to pick you up," he exclaims. "Now, let's go home." Elena asks what he'd meant by that, and he explains that they'd read her letter. He tells her the whole family had organized a meeting after getting her letter, and at first they weren't sure whether to bring her back for her safety, but after a few days of consideration, their father had agreed that it would be best to bring her home. Edward then asks if that's enough explanation and urges her to pack her things. Elena asks if he's asking that she leave her husband and return home for good, and he says yes. "Don't be ridiculous, Edward. I'm not going home." Elena explains that they'd gotten it all wrong, and she's much safer there than at the Sort Manor. Her brother cuts her off, telling her it's nonsense, and also reminds her how she'd almost gotten kidnapped. Elena asks her brother if he thinks that was because she was at the duchy, and when he says yes, she asks if he knew where the kidnapper was from. "He lived in the capital," she declares. Elena tells her brother that the duchy had nothing to do with it, and it could have been worse if she was at the capital. However, her brother responds that she's only making up assumptions, and she replies that she still can't agree with him. Elena orders her maids to bring out the magic artifacts that the Black Tower Master had prepared for her. She tells her brother all of those are for her safety, but he calls her a liar. "Why would I lie about something like this? If you're so suspicious, we can step outside and I'll show you." She orders the knights to come into the room and introduces them to her brother as her guards, but her brother isn't moved and only says he can't trust them. She orders the knights to leave and she speaks. "Edward, my dear brother, I know you're worried about me and I thank you for that, but still I'm surprised that you came all the way here for my sake, but I truly appreciate it. But you're overreacting to this. As you can see, I'm safe here and I'm not going back home because I don't need to," Elena speaks. She tells her brother she'll have a nice room prepared for him so he could stay the night before leaving the next day, but he interrupts and asks her, "What's the use of having all those artifacts? They failed to keep you safe once. How do we know it won't happen again?" Elena doesn't back down, and she asks her brother if he knows which shops have the best security measures. It's the ones that have been robbed of something precious, because they do everything they can to enhance their security so it won't ever happen again. "So there's no place that can keep me safer than the Mayhart Castle." However, Edward tells her it's still dangerous there. "We should have never let you marry someone with such a reputation to begin with. You may feel safe now, but if you stay here, the curse will." "Edward," Elena yells, cutting him off. Just as Elena is about to burst out in frustration, the Duke arrives, having heard there was an esteemed guest. He asks if he's interrupting anything, and Elena assures him he isn't. However, her brother Edward's face turns pale as the Duke approaches him. "It's been a while, Sir Edward. How have you been?" the Duke greets, extending his hand. Edward reaches out to shake the Duke's hand, but the Duke remains still, causing Edward to let out a groan of discomfort. The Duke then mentions that he has ordered the servants to prepare a feast and instructs Ben to take Edward away. Later that night, Elena asks the Duke if his arrival was intentional, explaining how he stepped into the drawing room just as she was about to confront Edward. "That wasn't a coincidence, was it?" she questions. "No," the Duke replies. Elena wonders why he intervened, noting that without him, she might have pulled half of Edward's hair out or even turned him bald. The Duke takes her hand and explains that that was exactly the reason, because he doesn't want her to have a disagreement with her family because of him. Elena reassures him that she wasn't going to argue. She simply wanted to serve justice. The Duke smiles at her response. "I'm sorry," Elena says, acknowledging that he had to hear her brother speak poorly of him. The Duke calls her name, taking her hand, and confesses that he doesn't care what anyone says about him unless it's coming from her. "I mean it, so you don't have to be upset about what he said earlier," he adds. As Elena settles into bed, she tells the Duke he can forgive Edward for his rude remark, but doesn't have to be nice to him since they don't get along well. The next morning, Edward listens seriously as Elena warns him never to speak about any rumors or nonsense regarding the Duke's curse. "You'd better remember that, or I won't think of you as family anymore," she warns. Edward agrees, but then asks if she's sure she doesn't want to return home. Elena, slightly exasperated, reminds him that she already answered that question the previous day. Her brother assures her that if it's about the contract, she doesn't need to worry. Confused, Elena asks what he means, and Edward explains that Miel has agreed to take her place if she decides to return. Elena is taken aback, exclaiming if he thinks she's dying or if she hit her head. Edward responds, frustrated, asking why she assumes Miel will always be a selfish little girl. He accuses her of disrespecting Miel with such thoughts, and then asks again if she will come home, but Elena firmly refuses. A few days later, as Elena gossips with her former nanny about her personal life, her brother comes to her insisting that they talk. As they walk, her brother speaks. "For as long as I can remember, you've always had a bad temper, but considering that you were never really greedy, you didn't ask for anything or throw tantrums to get whatever you want, and you were neither picky nor selfish. But a few months ago, you insisted on something for the very first time. You decided on it on your own without even telling us, and in fact you even told lies. You told us you wanted to marry Duke Mayhart in Miel's place because you love him, but I know you were lying about it." Her brother continues. Elena asks her brother if that was what Miel had said, but he only tells her that their family, although they're always fighting, they have the same parents and they grew up under the same roof, so he can obviously tell when she's lying. Her brother further shocks her when he tells her that, in fact, everyone in the family knew she was lying to them then. He tells her he can see the excuse she'd made up isn't entirely a lie anymore, but the important thing was that she'd insisted for something for the first time, and their father had agreed to let her do what she wanted, but he ended up regretting his decision after he received her letter and even ended up blaming himself for it. Elena reminds her brother that the incident had nothing to do with the duchy, and he says he knows. He tells her he wasn't being entirely rational, and he can't deny the fact that the duchy is the safest place for her. "I'm not telling you to come home for good, but you have to see father," her brother says. He tells her to meet with him and convince him that she'll be fine in the duchy. "It would be better to tell him yourself, you know that, right? That's all I'm asking for," he finishes. In a new scene, Sidron educates Elena about a teleportation magic circle. He tells her it would be easier to use a magic circle to move many people to the capital at once. As Edward observes the magic circles, Elena boasts about how skillful her husband's friend is. She tells her brother he will be teleporting all those people to the capital at once, which not many people can do. Sidron calls them to gather around the circle while Mary wishes Elena a safe trip because she decided to stay behind at the Mayhart Castle. She'd also broken up with her boyfriend she'd dated for a long time. The Duke calls Elena with a bright smile on his face, and she reflects on how he'd encouraged her to go pay a visit to her father. He told her since she never got to see her family since they wed, it would be nice to spend some time with them. He confided in her how much he'd feared the thought of her family hating him for refusing to send their daughter home. Elena had insisted that they hardly saw anyway, and he responded that he still wanted to impress the people who love and care for her. Elena bids farewell to the Duke, and as she recalls how they wouldn't be able to see each other for a few days, she stands on her tiptoes and executes an action that leaves everyone's mouth wide open. She'd given the Duke a peck on his cheek and said bye afterward. Elena arrives at her father's manor and immediately goes to her father, who stands in front of the fireplace. She asks why he has the fireplace lit, and he says he'd heard she was coming, and he remembered how much she used to like fireplaces when she was younger. She tells him she just liked it for the warmth, since she used to get cold easily. Her father tells her she was just like her mother, as her mother would often feel cold as well. You take after your mother the most, and I was always reminded of her whenever I looked at you. Perhaps that's why I was overprotective of you, her father admits. She tries to speak, but her father takes her hand and asks her if she remembers what Liliana had told her the day she gotten married. How she said she could always return home whenever she wanted. Elena tells her father she does remember. I want to tell you that we meant that wholeheartedly. Don't think about the circumstances or the people around you, he responds. Just focus on what you truly want. That being said, if you wish, you can always return home. We will always be ready to welcome you back, he concludes. He tells her he just wants her to know that, and with tears already forming in her eyes, she mutters, "Yes, father." During dinner, Elena drinks a little too much, prompting her sister to suggest a walk outside. Gratefully accepting the advice, Elena sits by the water fountain, feeling the breeze help sober her up. She calls out to Edward, asking how long he plans to stay hidden. "Well, what do you think?" she asks, leaving Edward confused for a second, but she clarifies that she's talking about her husband. She asks him to be honest with her on whether he's a good man. Elena tells him she knows he has an eye for people, and that's probably his only strength, and he is barely able to compete against their older sister to be the heir thanks to that. As her brother remains quiet, he recalls his conversation with the Duke. He'd gone to him and asked why he wasn't kicking him out since he'd arrived uninvited, and not to mention he'd been rude to him, also so he'd asked if he's only being a gracious host because he's Elena's brother. The Duke had responded that he was sure he'd heard the rumors about him regardless of whether or not they were true. He knew how people saw him, and he probably had the same impression of him as well. "If you cared about those rumors, you would have avoided me in the drawing room on the first day you got here. You would have been afraid of being affected by my curse, but you did nothing of the sort. Lord Edward, you're welcome to stay here because I can see you are a good brother who genuinely cares about my wife. Does that answer your question?" That was the Duke's response. After a while of rubbing his head, he responds to Elena that he doesn't know whether he's a good man, but he can see that he will be a good husband to her, leaving Elena with a bright smile. Later, Sidron walks with a lantern, after checking for intruders as he reflects on how he set up double barriers after Kiffin's persistent nagging. On his way back, he's startled by Elena's older sister, Liliana, calling out to him from the window, drunkenly asking him to come closer. Cautiously, he confirms she's speaking to him, and she nicknames him Sayuri. He hesitates, but she insists she'll come to him instead, though he assures her he'll be there soon. He finally goes to meet her, and she begins speaking about her sister who had recently gotten married. She tells him she knows marriage is nice, but she can't understand why she'd done it. She tells him it's funny that she wouldn't even tell her the real reason behind why she did it, and why it had to be her, but she can't bring it up because she's clearly trying to hide it. Liliana tells him she doesn't know what's on her mind. She's just a frail little girl, so why is she trying to carry so much on her shoulders? I'm her big sister, so I feel like I have to figure out what is going on. However, Sidron assures her that even if he doesn't know anything elsewhere from what he'd seen in the Mayheart Castle, Elena seemed happy. So she's happy. I'm glad, Ileana says before falling asleep. Sidron checks to confirm she's asleep, then gently picks her up and carries her to her bedroom. The next morning, Elena observes her sister relating with Sidron, and as soon as he gets out, she asks him if something had happened. Sidron then explains to Elena that he'd helped her the previous night since she'd fallen asleep in an uncomfortable place, but they could find her room, so he took her to a bedroom. My sister might have been embarrassed for her clumsiness, Elena thinks when Sidron speaks and says he'd thought there could be no title more surprising than Black Tower Lord. After all, I learned one thing. Blood is thicker than water, he says before leaving. In a new scene, Miel angrily slams her hand on the table and confesses to Elena that her earlier statement about taking her place was a lie. She explains that Amber had been frustrating her, claiming he was always ready to step aside for her happiness and that she should get rid of him when she no longer needs him. Elena also visits her uncle, who thanks her for her sacrifice. He also tells her they'd succeeded in finding their first relic. Her uncle had obtained the ancient relic buried in the mine as a condition for marriage. Excavating the relic was her uncle's long-cherished dream, and also finding the relic would bring honor to their family. Elena congratulates him and asks what kind of relic it is, and he mentions that although it is still under investigation, there was a chance that it could be a weapon. Her uncle invites her to see it, but she refuses, thinking of how she had no interest in seeing something used in past wars. In a new scene, Elena decides to go get some tarts, but soon their carriage comes to an abrupt stop. She hears someone mention that there was a carriage blocking the road ahead. A priest comes to Elena and apologizes, saying their wheel had fallen off, so they'll just have to wait till it's reattached. However, Sidron uses his ability to lift the carriage for them to pass through. He tells the priest says if he had traveled with workers from the start, none of that would have happened, and it was because he didn't want to ride with dirty servants. I hope you learned your lesson, he ends. Later at night, Elena goes to Sidron, who apologizes, saying she was in charge, but he'd acted on his own. Elena assures him that it's okay since she would have done the same thing if she were in his shoes, and afterwards asks what he was thinking about. He tells her it's the Duke, and she says how coincidental because she was also thinking of him, and she'd been thinking of him since earlier, but Sidron tells her there's no need to feel competitive, since instead he was just reminded because of what happened earlier. She asks if he was talking about the priests, and he says yes before stopping in front of her and asking, "You don't know how I met Kiffin, do you?" He tells Elena that 7 years ago he'd approached him first as he was trying to gather evidence that Kiffin was cursed by a demon. He reflects on how he dragged himself on the ground holding onto the priest's garment, begging for something to eat. So the priest suggested they take him in at the temple, assuring him that if he came with him, he would no longer have to worry about being hungry. After that he became a priest, and on this day, a lady knelt in his presence, asking if her child would still live, and just as usual he assured her that her child would live through her faith. He later went to the priest to report how the lady had come, and how he'd told her her son would live even though he'd mentioned that her son's disease was incurable even for the temple. Unconcerned, the priest only asked if he hadn't warned him to focus on his duties, which is to give faith to the followers, and aside that there's no need to know or care about anything else. However, younger Sidron had insisted and mentioned how the lady believed so much in her son's healing that she was making enormous donations to the temple every week, but that didn't sit well with the priest. He warned that since he kept on disobeying, there was nothing he could do, so he made the other young priests confine him in the basement for 3 days. He should be released 3 days after, and if he complains again, he should be locked up for a day without a drop of water. That was his punishment. Elena is so shocked by the atrocious actions of the temple that she asks if after that people still come to the temple and pray. Sidron explains to her that not everyone who had come to the temple with an illness had died, and occasionally there were some cases of miraculous recoveries. Although it was only 1 in 100 cases, it was enough. That was enough to attract desperate people to the temple, he adds. He continues and mentions that he'd met the Duke 2 years later when the temple's status wasn't what it used to be because within disasters like droughts or floods, there was no reason to make sacrifices to the gods. He tells Elena that there were voices of doubts about the temple amongst the nobility, and so the priest came up with a plan. Using the rumor that the Duke de Mihar was cursed by a demon, they decided to prove those rumors true and also perform a ritual to expel the curse from the land. They will gather proof that the Duke is truly cursed by a demon and make it known to the world. After that, they will perform a grand exorcism to ensure no one else falls victim to such demonic curses. That way we can showcase the temple's power. It's not a bad idea. But how will you gather evidence? And the man had responded that they will look hard enough and find something suspicious, if not they'll create it. Just like that, Sidron was put in charge of the task, and his part was simple. He was to stay around the Duke as much as possible and find anything suspicious, but in case he found nothing, he was told to get hurt in front of everyone, and if he got injured in front of many witnesses, the temple would claim that the injury was caused by demonic powers. Despite the disgust he'd felt, the first thought he had upon seeing Kiffin was that he wished he had that demonic curse instead of him. He and Kiffin had spoken for a while, and he confessed to how he'd become a puppet in a white priest's robe, proving his loyalty by taking innocent people's money. Otherwise, the temple would send him to prison and starve him for days. He continued speaking to the young Duke even when he didn't get a response, and finally he revealed the real reason behind his appearance. "I need to find evidence that you were cursed, otherwise I wouldn't be in the same place as you." The young Duke immediately stopped and asked if he knew how you use magic. "You know how, yet you hide it. Are you afraid the temple will exploit your abilities if they are known?" He'd asked the Duke how he'd found out, but the Duke only responded with a question. "Why don't you leave the temple? What's the reason you don't quit being a priest?" Sidron had explained to the Duke that to remove the robe, he needed to erase his name from the list in the High Priest's room, a place he couldn't access. The Duke had asked if he couldn't just force his way in, then he replied that they had guards at the temple, but the Duke had asked if he couldn't just bring down anyone who gets in his path, since he had the power to do that, but Sidron remained quiet. An awkward silence followed, and finally, the Duke told him he guessed he wouldn't be able to do it himself. The Duke explained that he used to be just like him, and at one point, he didn't care whether his family lived or died, and when they did die, he felt nothing but still. He couldn't bring himself to take their lives. When the Duke inquired what Sidron would do if he could escape the temple, Sidron replied that he might learn more magic, though he hadn't given it much thought. Later, as he stood by a window, Kiffin threw a book at him. "Sidron, is this the list? Burn it all or erase your name." Sidron later learned that it had only taken an hour, not a day, for the Duke to enter the temple, take down the knights, and break through the high priest's barrier. Sidron asked the Duke what he should do to repay that huge favor, but the Duke had responded that he doesn't need to do anything, and instead he can just do what he wants. For the first time, Sidron experienced freedom and became a disciple of the Black Tower Master, and a year later, he assumed the role of Master himself. He shared with Elena that he often wondered what his life would have been like if Kiffin hadn't intervened. Perhaps he would still be a temple slave, slowly losing his sanity, or he might have gone on a reckless rampage, killing a few priests and living in fear for the rest of his life. After becoming the Black Tower Master, he returned the list, having erased only his own name. The following day, Elena visited the temple, demanding the return of all donations made in her name. Sidron, noticing her presence, questioned why she had come for that. She replied that if she didn't do at least this, she would collapse from frustration. Once taken to the priest, she firmly demanded the complete retrieval of her donations, insisting not a single penny was to be missing. The priest, taken aback, inquired about her sudden change of heart, reminding her that donations couldn't be refunded simply due to emotional or personal reasons, especially if someone had lost faith in the temple because of another's words. Elena confronted him directly, asking, "What do you think about the incident 7 years ago? Manipulating evidence to tarnish my husband's reputation within the temple. Do you feel any remorse, even a little? It seems there's a misunderstanding. I didn't try to tarnish his reputation. However, I did try to prove the truth. It's unfortunate, but isn't it a fact that the Duchess's husband received a curse from the devil? While the temple only sought to reveal that truth, the priest responds. He continues, I admit to using methods that were somewhat inappropriate in the process, but for the sake of ignorant and good people, it must be known that the devil's curse is real in the world. The temple's excessive sense of duty and mission caused me to make a slight mistake. Elena remains calm and demands evidence that her husband had truly received a curse from the devil, but the priest only asks if she hasn't seen the stains on her husband's face. Haven't you heard that the stains resemble the ancient devil's pattern? Elena responds that she'd heard it was similar but not the same, but the priest tells her that because of the similarity, it's difficult to ignore it as a mere coincidence since the problem starts with the similarity from the beginning. The clear fact is that the Duke received the devil's curse. Isn't there any solid evidence? The priest responds. Elena tells him she'd thought it would come to that, but it was exactly as she'd expected. She directs his attention to the book in front of him, a pattern carved when offering sacrifices to the ancient devil, a pattern just like that which was on the right pillar of the temple. It's indeed carved there, but it's not the same. If you look closely, the edges are different. The priest tries to explain, but Elena responds that the slight difference isn't important. Instead, the problem begins with the similarity from the beginning. Don't you agree, priest? Elena asks. Later, Elena and Sidron walk out of the temple holding sacks containing coins. Sidron asks her how she'd known about the pattern on the temple pillar, and she responds that she'd seen it in a book. She tells him the temple had been studied by artists for a long time, so she looked through the book of artists who've dealt with the temple's different decorative patterns. Sidron then asks how she knew it was similar to the one being used to offer sacrifices to the devil, and she responds that she didn't originally know but had somehow found a similar pattern while rummaging through the library. Sidron asks what she plans to do with the money, but she responds with a question. Would you like to have it? But he declines. She asks if he's perhaps uncomfortable since it's from the temple, and frankly he says yes. She hands the bags containing coins to the knights, thinking to get them some new supplies or armor. On the other side, Priest Becca remains in the office, frustrated over the incident when a man rushes in with information. Prince Becca interrupts him and asks who the person who'd left the temple a while ago was, since he'd felt a sacred aura, one that matched exactly what's recorded in the scriptures. The very presence that opened the era of the temple, driving out the extraordinary and healing the dying. The priest is now restless and rambles that it's been almost 200 years since someone with a sacred aura appeared. So they must capture the woman and appoint her as a holy woman. The man with him assures him that it must have been a mistake, and when the priest asks why, he responds that the person who'd left the temple a few minutes ago was the Duchess of Demihar, the wife of the Duke. The priest suggests that they persuade Elena, while the other man reports how she'd come to the temple and asks if they could reflect even a little on the incident that happened 7 years ago. She will never cooperate with the temple. Rather, if she uses her sacred aura, she could establish a new sect. Priest Becca assures him that it's a mistake. Besides, in the past, sacred aura might have been necessary, but illnesses can be treated with medicine, and there are no more evil things to be expelled from the land. In fact, even if sacred auras were to revive now, what good would it do? It wouldn't greatly help the temple's prosperity like in the past, Priest Becca concludes, ending the conversation. In a new scene, a man laughs maniacally, leaving Rebecca repulsed. I used my powers to shut him up because he wouldn't stop screaming all day, but instead it turned him into a complete fool, she says. Rebecca reflects on how she'd thought everything would be solved if she'd just played the victim, but instead, the Duke cut off all their sources of income and bought up their debts. The family will go down if he demands the money back, so no wonder my father went crazy. But even the Viscount of Hyena is helping the Duke of the Mayheart Palace. She reflects on how she'd planned to deal with all that after inheriting the family title, but not in that manner. Rebecca summons her trusted knight and orders him to report whatever Elena does in the capital from then on. After ending the conversation, she goes into a locked room with a spell circle on the ground and thinks, well, it doesn't matter. I have this. There's a secret place no one else knows of except for me. Yes, that's right, I found it by chance while cleaning. Some maids discuss while Rebecca listens in. As she wonders what the scribbling on the floor is, she suddenly gets a nosebleed, and as it drops onto the circle, it lights it up. Rebecca stands looking at the dead bear in the circle, wondering what that means when she spots a script beside it, and it reads, Next, inform the Blessed One who discovered this place. This symbol is the interdimensional summoning seal. If a living being is summoned, it's extremely dangerous, so immediately return it using the cancellation spell listed below, while if a dead thing is summoned, its body beauty can be used. The effects and method of blah. Later, Rebecca speaks to a man who kneels in her presence, assuring him that she will give him power if he pledges his loyalty to her, and he immediately swears. She directs him to a vial containing red liquid, assuring that if he takes it, his body will be incomparably stronger than before. The blood of the dead creatures summoned not only makes a human desire into reality, but it also has the effect of disposing of corpses in an instant. Rebecca also recalls how before the former owner of the manor had passed, they tried their best not to sell that manor. Was it because of it? She questions. Sometimes living monsters were summoned, but it was okay if they could use the summon cancellation spell written on the sheepskin. Incan had found Rebecca in that room, and to answer his question, she took out a dagger and made a small cut on his finger, dropping the blood precisely onto the circle. His blood had the ability to bear offspring on its own, which was strange, and also a pathetic desire to Rebecca. In a new scene, she stands in front of the circle thinking, when I killed and cleared it, I should have stolen and eaten the blood that strengthens the human body during pregnancy before running away. Without wasting time, she makes a cut on her hand and pours the blood onto the scribblings, activating the circle, and this time another dead animal is summoned. Now there's no option, she says before leaving severe slashes on the beast several times. First I kidnap the Duchess and use her to kill the Duke. Afterwards get rid of her as well. So the monster loves someone. Well, it wouldn't be so bad to die for the sake of love. What a romantic ending it will be, Rebecca finishes. In the sort manner, Elena's father encourages her to pursue her desires, stating that their household will sever ties with the temple. Overwhelmed with love, she confesses her feelings to him. The following morning, the manor is engulfed in chaos. Frustrated, Elena pounds her pillow, recalling how she had reserved the temple's main hall for her wedding. How uncomfortable my husband must feel. I can't redo the wedding, she laments, until an idea suddenly strikes her. Determined, she decides to plan a new wedding, changing the venue and the officiant. As she envisions the Duke's mansion as the new location, her sister interrupts her thoughts. Her sister suggests they go out together, but sensing Elena's preoccupation, she reassures her that she can take her time. Elena asks where they're headed, and her sister mentions visiting some shops, encouraging her to join in on her hobby now that she's back home. As they shop, Elena tries on various dresses, but the outing drags on longer than expected. Suddenly, a masked man enters the shop, ignoring the lady's protests. He approaches Elena directly, and when she asks for his identity, he replies that they can introduce themselves later and insists she follow him. Elena notices a red pendant around his neck, and his voice echoes in her mind. "Let's go. Don't make a sound and follow me." Fear grips her as she realizes everyone else has gone still. She covers her mouth as she gags at the foul stench filling the air, and instinctively, she activates one of Sidron's magic artifacts. In an instant, her guards burst in, asking questions, and as she searches for the masked man, her guards draw her attention to a figure with long blonde hair lying on the ground, writhing in pain. Elena, spotting the wig beside the person, goes to take a closer look, and upon closer inspection she realizes that she'd seen the person from somewhere, but before Elena can think of where, the man looks up and attacks her again with his pendant. Elena tries to communicate with her personal guards, but she doesn't get any response, and as she looks around she realizes that they're frozen again. Suddenly, Elena's sister begins walking towards the man, and she only tries to stop her, but it's too late as the man soon holds a knife to her throat. Holding the knife to Liliana's throat, the man speaks. "Pa, so it really doesn't work on you, but why? What makes you so different?" Elena demands to know what the man wants from her, and as he reflects on how he'd thought no one other than the Duke would be able to fight the power of the necklace, he orders her to drop all of her jewelry to the ground. Elena assures the man that she's taken them off when from nowhere, a man's hand wraps around her throat, and she is shocked to see it is her trusted knight, Sir Max. As Elena feels Sir Max's hand slightly shaking, she realizes he's trying to fight back. She tries to direct him on what to do, but that fails, and soon she drops to the ground. The man goes to Elena to confirm if she's dead, but as soon as he goes closer, Elena immediately grabs the dagger and tosses it away. She attacks the man and immediately aims for the outside. Thomas quickly regains consciousness, and just before he could attack the man with blonde hair, a knight appears from nowhere and begins attacking him. As Elena panics, the man with blonde hair orders the knight to unalive everyone but the Duchess. The knights take Elena behind them, trying to protect her, but the man appears from a different angle each time and slashes them. With no knight left standing, Elena realizes she needs to use the artifacts, and just as she reaches for them, the knight gets behind her, but Sir Colin grabs onto his leg, and in a swing of his sword, blood splatters everywhere, distracting Elena for a moment. Suddenly someone else attacks, and as Elena turns, she spots Kiffin standing with Sidron and the others. Kiffin immediately goes for the knight, and soon sends his sword flying. The knight's hand trembled as he struggles to use black magic, and just as the Duke is about to land his final strike, the knight notices Elena weak on the floor and immediately pulls out a dagger and swings it in her direction, causing the Duke to switch from attack to defense as he quickly diverts it with his sword. The knight escapes with the man with blonde hair, and as the others go after them, Kiffin picks Elena up and says he'll answer whatever questions she had later, but first they needed to get her back home to have her wound treated. In a new scene, someone questions why Elena hasn't woken up if there's nothing wrong with her. The doctor reassures them that, as he mentioned earlier, she's likely just recovering. The cut on her hand appears to be her only injury, and she should improve with time. But she hardly ever gets sick. "Don't tell me this is just because she's weak," the man protests. At that moment, Elena opens her eyes and spots her brother questioning the doctor's thoroughness, calling him a fraud. She interrupts, grumbling about the noise. Her brother rushes to her side, while Kiffin offers her a glass of water. "Did I faint?" she asks, and her brother informs her that she was unconscious the entire afternoon. Eagerly, Elena inquires if they managed to catch the woman with the mask and waist-length blonde hair, but her brother admits they lost her. Kiffin notes that there was blood on the floor, suggesting the woman was injured, but still managed to escape. He adds that he ordered the knights to search for her based on her description. Reflecting on the gruesome scene, her brother grimly mentions that body parts were found in the pool of blood, fearing the attacker might die before they can capture her. That masked woman, I think she might be Rebecca Marson, Elena reveals. The Duke asks if it was perhaps because the color of her hair, and Elena reflects on how her hair was dark blonde as if color had faded from it, and she says that one, but she also had the same smell Incan had. Her brother asks her what she means, and she says she was wondering if perhaps Rebecca had practiced black magic, just as Incan had done. The Duke tells Elena he'd already sent someone to House Marson to check Rebecca's whereabouts, and it appeared that she disappeared right before she was attacked, meaning she might be the culprit. Elena explains that the attacker used a necklace, prompting her brother to pull out a pendantless necklace and drop it into her palm. Curious, Elena asks about the jewel, and he reveals that it was crushed into powder, resembling grains of sand. He offers to show her the substance, explaining that they sent half to the Black Tower and the other half to the Royal Magic Department, since Elena mentioned that the woman seemed to wield strange powers through the jewel. How could it be completely pulverized and not cracked? Then again, the likely culprit, Rebecca, had ridiculous other powers as well, Elena thinks. Elena asks for Liliana, and he tells her that she was with Sidron and is doing much better than her since she didn't cut her hand or faint. Elena asks about the knights, and he tells her that they were resting after getting treated, since they'd gotten hurt, but the doctor had explained that they should recover soon. He also informs Elena that their dad had gone to the royal palace to request cooperation in searching for the culprit, and he'd taken the crushed jewel for analysis as well, so he'll be back the next day. Elena demands to be left alone with her husband, prompting her brother to seriously remind her that the whole family lives in the manor, and sounds carry easily through the walls. After he leaves, Elena clarifies with the Duke that this wasn't the reason she sent her brother away, and the Duke smiles, saying he already knew. Elena begins recounting the incident at the dress shop, sharing how happy she was to see him and how amazing he was during the ordeal. After a while, she finally expresses her gratitude. "Thank you for saving me, Kiffin." Elena notices the Duke seems upset and asks why. He admits he's filled with regret, saying he shouldn't have let her come to the capital by herself. Elena reminds him that he had sent her with 3 knights and Sidron, but the Duke insists that he should have come along. When Elena asks if he's implying the attack was his fault, he remains silent and she pleads with him not to blame himself, reminding him that he still saved her life. Elena realizes that the Duke isn't listening to her at all, and she decides to take a different approach. She asks if he remembered how they'd gone to the festival together, and there was a commotion, so everyone had gathered, and then a man recognized her and called her name, and everyone recognized him and started whispering, "That was my fault," she says, leaving the Duke shocked. She tells him that if she hadn't taken him to the festival in the first place, all those people wouldn't have said things about him, so she's to blame, but the Duke tells her it's nonsense and asks how it's her fault. Elena tells the Duke that that's what she's trying to say. As she stands on the bed, she asks if he'd known she'd get attacked, and despite that he'd still sent her to the capital, but he didn't know that would happen. "Please don't say you should have prepared for every possible scenario. That way it will never end," Elena retorts. She also tells the Duke she never wants to hear him blame himself or regret things he's done, and if he ever does it again, she'll sleep in a different room. And as she begins to regret the punishment she'd chosen, the Duke breaks the silence. "I'll try my best." In a new scene, Elena sits and asks if the plan was for her to try several dresses at the shop to give the Duke time to sneak in and surprise her, and her sister confirms it, saying they thought she'd enjoy it. Elena tries to pick a tomato with a fork, but it slides off, and she remarks that it was thanks to her siblings that she'd hurt her right hand, but as she turns her head, she spits the Duke holding a fork with tomato to her mouth with a smile on his face. As the Duke feeds Elena, her brother asks if they really have to do that, but she doesn't argue, and says if he has a problem with it, he should get a doctor who can heal her immediately. Her brother asks her what her plans are after their meal, and she says she's going to see the knights. At noon, Elena goes to see the knights, but their reaction is unexpected. They tell her that they were only faking being sick, and even when blood poured out their mouth, they tell her it was only tomato juice to assist with their act. "Thank you. Thank you everyone, and Sir Colin. You were amazing. I'm proud to have the 3 of you as my guards," Elena says. The knights tell Elena they don't deserve her kind words, and if only they could get stronger, but Elena cuts them off, asking them to stop and focus only on their recovery. You'll be in big trouble if you strain yourselves and end up opening your wounds again, Elena says before leaving, and as she walks she hears them burst into tears. In a new scene, the doctor examines Elena and is surprised that she's completely healed in just a week. It's time to return to the duchy, so she hugs her sister goodbye in front of the manor, and also her father and brother, but just as she's about to leave, she spots her sister making eyes at her, but it's not long that she realizes that she isn't making those eyes at her but Sidron. In the sort manner, Edward asks Liliana if she thinks Elena is happy, and when she says yes, he tells her that now that he thinks about it, things were so hectic and sudden when Elena got married that he didn't feel like it was actually happening, and only then does he realize that Elena is really a duchess. As Edward turns around, he gasps as he finds a familiar face standing. "Andy Den, when did you return?" he asks. Edward wraps his arm around him as he reveals that he'd gotten back that day, and he hadn't sent word in advance so he could surprise him. He asks if everyone is home, and as Edward mentions everyone, he leaves out Elena, prompting Andy Den to ask if she'd gone out to town. Finally, Edward explains that Elena had gotten married. He asks to whom, and he says to Duke Mayhart. Andy Den tells him he's disappointed since he believed he and his father were different from everyone else, but they still did that to Elena. Did gaining money and profit for the family mean so much to you? He asks as he retreats to his carriage. In the Mayhart Duchy, the butler comes to the Duke and tells him that there were no indications of Rebecca Marson entering the manor or the estate. He asks about the academy where Viscount Marson's youngest son stays in, and he says they haven't noticed any signs there as well. He also tells the Duke he'd hired a few more guilds in the capital and will soon expand the search to the entire city, and the Duke tells him not to stop the investigation and surveillance until at least the body has been found. Later, Elena knocks on the Duke's office door, and after coming in, she asks if he'd like to have some tarts with her that the chef had made, one of his greatest masterpieces yet, which would be a waste to eat them alone. Sure, the Duke responds with a smile on his face. 10 days later, Elena smiles brightly as she reflects on how the Duke's work has been completed and the knights have fully recovered. She decides to slowly get ready for their long-awaited new wedding. She checks out the garden and decides that it would be good for the reception. She begins planning. We can hold the main ceremony in the banquet hall, and Ben can officiate the wedding. As she tries to figure out how she'd get the wedding dress, Mary comes to her and informs her that there was a guest who'd arrived at the Mayhart Castle. Elena goes to the dining hall and is surprised to find Andy sitting there. Andy reflects on how they'd first met. Her brother had brought him to her, and at first meeting, she shortened his name to Andy, and from then on they became friends. Andy smiles and asks the Duke if he doesn't think she was reckless for shortening someone's name to 2 syllables at the first meeting, and the Duke says it's very much like her. Elena, embarrassed, kicks Andy's foot under the table as a signal for him to stop, but he doesn't just stop there. He turns to the Duke and asks if he knows Elena can be really violent, but Elena gets tired of listening to him out her that she forces a carrot into his mouth. However, Andy doesn't back down, and he asks the Duke if he knows Elena is a terrible embroiderer. One day she'd embroidered an animal on a handkerchief and gave it to the Count as a gift, but the Count couldn't tell what animal it was and even offered a reward to anyone who could identify it. He continues and says the Count didn't want to ask Elena directly and hurt her feelings, so he tried to quietly figure it out without Elena knowing, but one of the servants couldn't keep it a secret. Elena shoves a broccoli into his mouth again, but this time the Duke speaks and asks what animal it was, a raccoon. Later, Elena privately scolds her childhood friend and also suggests he returns back, but he calls her name and says he was showing off earlier at the dining table. I was showing off how well I know you and how much time we've spent together. Elena asks why he would like to brag about that, but he only responds saying who knows. Are you happy after getting married? Is your married life happy? Elena says yes, and he says then they'll see whether she's lying for the sake of her family, since 5 years is a long time. Elena is confused, and he reveals that he'll be staying there for a while. Later, Elena lays in bed with the Duke, who asks if she was close to Viscount Kale, and she responds that they were close since their family interacted frequently. Elena tells the Duke he wasn't like that originally. He was weak and timid, and she used to take care of him like a big sister, but he's changed a lot since she last saw him. The Duke asks Elena why they'd parted ways, and she responds that it's because Andy was born weak and would often collapse when he was young after walking a short distance under the hot sun. And to make their son healthy, the Marquis and his wife took Andy and left the kingdom to go abroad. Anyway, it's fortunate that he seems to have returned healthy, Elena says and sighs when she hears the Duke ask, "Elena, can I hug you?" Elena, surprised, responds saying, "What do you mean?" But the Duke repeats it and says he wants to hug her. Elena accepts and the Duke pulls her into his arms, pressing her head against his firm chest, and even though all that was going through her head as her hand trembled was to rub her hand across his chest, she stops herself thinking she can't risk losing his trust by harassing him. The next day, Elena sits with her maid Mary, who speaks of how healthy Andy had gotten ever since he'd gotten back. Elena agrees with her and reflects on how when they were younger it was difficult for him to even walk, and he was so frail that it seemed like he could collapse at any moment, and her younger self used to carry a handkerchief around thinking her friend might cough up blood at any time. When you meet that healthy prince of the forest later on, ask him something. What exactly is it that he wants to do here? Elena says to Mary. She decides not to bother herself with worrying about Andy's drastic change, so she calls both Mary and Anna and shares her plans for the second wedding with them. A week later, Elena stands wondering if the preparation for the reception hall is almost ready. The first plan was to keep the wedding preparations a secret from her husband, and the next step was to propose to him once the preparations have been completed. Elena glances at the enchanted flower and reflects on how Abby had reported that Ben had been practicing his officiating speech in his room for days, so she'll propose that day. At the lake that I picked as our date spot, we'll go boating and set the mood, then I'll give him the prepared flowers and propose. Elena's face suddenly loses all emotion as Andy suddenly appears in front of her. She tries to walk away, but Andy asks if she plans to go boating with her husband on the lake, and when she asks how he'd found out, he tells her he has his ways. Elena, thinking that Mary must have told him, comes clean and explains that she plans to go boating with her husband, and she's about to propose to him, but he asks her to let him come with them. He assured her that he wouldn't get on the boat, and she should just take him to the lake, but Elena refuses and asks if he plans on sabotaging it. He assures Elena that he wouldn't interfere, and instead he'll help her make her proposal more splendid. Elena asks how he's going to do that, but he just smiles. "Elena, aren't you curious? About where I've been, what I've done for the past 5 years, how did I change so much before coming back?" Andy asks. Elena is confused, so she asks what that has to do with him helping with her proposal, but he only says she'll see, and after she calms down he asks if she'll take him with her. "If you interfere, you wouldn't see my face for a long time," Elena warns, but he reassures her saying she shouldn't worry since her happiness is most important to him. In a new scene, Elena asks the Duke if he's okay with not wearing a mask, and he says yes. "I'm going out with my wife after all," he says as he takes her hand and helps her into the carriage. In the carriage, Elena can't stop thinking of how she'd chosen a time when the lake would be deserted on purpose. What exactly is Andy planning? Elena thinks, reflecting on how he'd advised her to go to the lake after it gets dark, since that's the only way he can help her properly. They finally arrive at the lake, and Elena leaves the Duke alone, standing for a brief moment. Andy appears from nowhere and explains to the Duke that for the past few days he'd been observing things around, whether that place can make Elena happy without causing any issues. He asks if Elena is truly happy, and the Duke asks him what the results of his observations were and what he'd concluded. Andy tells him she seemed happy, and the environment didn't seem too bad itself. He tells him that's fortunate, but he tells the Duke that it's still too early to relax. "It's just the end of the first verification. I will continue to monitor you," Andy says to the Duke. Andy tells the Duke he knows he has a right to do so since Elena was like a family to him, since they were young, not to mention they'd grown up together. As the Duke recalls how Elena had explained that she used to take care of him like a sister, he lets out a laugh, but Andy tells him that is only a sincere message, and it would be wise for him not to take it lightly since, unlike Elena's family, who might find it difficult to get news from there directly to the capital, he has his own ways. "That's good," the Duke says. "Please continue to monitor me so I don't make any mistake and ensure that nothing affects my wife's happiness. Her happiness is more important to me than anything else." Andy asks the Duke if he isn't bothering him, but the Duke says it's indeed bothering, but that's not more important than his wife's happiness. Elena arrives and takes the Duke along with her to the boat. Just as they are riding on the water, for a moment, Elena gets distracted by the amount of fireflies that suddenly fill the night sky. Kiffin, Elena calls as she extends the flower to him. She tells him it's a magic-infused flower, and according to the merchant, even if it's planted anywhere, it wouldn't wither for over 100 years. Kiffin, would you marry me again and be with me for 100 more years? No, even longer, living happily together, she proposes. The Duke accepts the flower and then gives his answer. Yes, if it's you, I'll gladly accept it. In a new scene, Elena gets dressed when Andy comes and asks if they can talk for a moment. They get outside and Elena asks what he'd done at the lake, and also where he's been and what he's been doing for the past 5 years. Do you remember when we were young? When the full moon was out at night, we would sometimes climb trees like this to get a closer look at the full moon? Andy asks, and she responds saying yes, and she was usually the only one who got scolded. Andy gets on the tree and asks if she'll like to come up, but she responds saying no since her hair night gets ruined. Andy tells Elena that when he was younger he'd thought he would marry her when they grew up. Are you confessing to me? Elena asks sharply, but he gets down from the tree and responds that he isn't confessing, so she shouldn't run away and just listen instead. He tells Elena that when he thinks about it, there have been many times when he should have thanked her, reflecting on how he was crying alone because of just how weak he was, and she'd come to comfort him, telling him it wasn't his fault he was born that way. He tells Elena he genuinely wanted to be like her, and he admires her. He also tells her he thought he needed to get strong like her and repay all the kindness she'd shown to him, but she just asks what he should repay since it's not a debt, and he responds that he'd thought she'd say something like that, but that was how he felt, and it still remained that way till that moment. Andy recalls how he'd pleaded with his father to let him go to the Krail Kingdom, mentioning how he'd heard that if he passes the sage's trial there, he can obtain special power, and that special power will also heal his body. Andy also tells Elena that the reason he said he thought he would marry her is because he believed that would make her happy. Elena is left confused by that statement, so he explains that for them, they usually marry a partner chosen by their family, and compared to someone she'd never seen, he thought he would be a better husband for her. Elena tells Andy that marrying him would feel like marrying a family member, and she would have opposed it no matter what. Andy asks why, since when they were kids they used to play house and take on the role of husband and wife, but Elena cuts him off and says they were very young then, so he shouldn't try bringing that up in front of her husband. He jokes at first and then admits that he has no intentions of interfering between her and her husband, and at first he'd come to check if it was a marriage forced by her family, but she looks really happy, so he would never do anything to cause trouble. He tells Elena that he'll now give her answers to the questions she's asked about his whereabouts 5 years ago and what he'd done at the lake. Andy makes a bird out of nowhere, and Elena gasps as she realizes that he'd learnt spirit magic. He tells her that it is a wind spirit and its name is Sylphie, and it was thanks to it that he was able to send fireflies around the boat the previous night. Elena asks if he can handle other magic, and he says, water, fire, and earth to some extent. He also tells her that he'll be sending Sylphie occasionally to check on her, and if she's ever having a hard time, she should let him know, and he'll always be ready to act for her. He tells her he'd already confirmed that she's happy, and that's enough for him, so he'll be taking his leave. As he turns to leave, Elena calls him and asks him to not just go, but he should also take the bouquet with him. The long-awaited day arrived, and both Elena and the Duke stood in front of Ben. Suddenly, Elena panics as she hears Ben say they should exchange vows with a kiss, since that wasn't part of the script. The Duke turns to Elena, pulling her in by her waist and grabbing onto her jaw when he finally goes in for the kiss. After the kiss, the Duke notices Elena's red cheeks. He panics, asking if she's okay. They move on to the banquet toss, and Elena signals Andy, telling him he has to catch it, and she smiles before finally letting the bouquet into the air. She goes to Rosalind and asks why she'd left the Viscount estate, and her friend asks if she knows Miel, her cousin. She tells her they'd broken off her engagement, and though she didn't know who, apparently her fiancé was in love with someone else. She explains that he'd said he couldn't go through with the marriage and left. She explains how her cousin had cried and walked after having the engagement broken off, and after a week had gone by they found out that the name of the fiancé was Abelmark. Elena introduces Andy to her friend Rosalind. After talking with Rosalind for a while, he pulls out something from his jacket, and when Elena asks what it is, he says it's a wedding gift. When Elena opens it, she realizes it's a map, and he says it marks the location where the artifact is buried. She tells him she isn't interested in artifacts, and he says he'd thought she might say that, but that isn't an ordinary artifact. He tells Elena that rumor has it that that was where the holy sword is buried. As he speaks, Elena's gaze is fixed on the map, and she realizes that they're close and it should only take a day by carriage to get there. Andy tells her she's always been interested in the holy sword, but she asks if that location isn't within Count Morgan's territory and if they can just dig without permission. He tells Elena they'll need the permission of Count Morgan's, but it shouldn't be too difficult because it doesn't seem like the Count has any intention of personally excavating the holy sword. In a new scene, Elena rides in a carriage. She can't get her mind over the fact that the holy sword had been discovered that early, and after a while of brainstorming, she realizes that in the future she'd seen it was most likely that the holy sword was already in someone else's possession. But if there was a holy sword, why were they defeated so helplessly? Elena wonders. Suddenly Elena remembers the old lady's words, awakening the power of the legendary sword that is passed down to a hero. You will find the holy sword in the heart of the Demon King. Elena realizes that in the future she'd seen, no one was able to awaken the power of the holy sword, hence furthering her role and goal to birth a hero. Elena, I'm curious about two things, Andy says. He asks her why she's the one taking care of things instead of just sending an excavation team, and why he's included in the party that's going to dig up the holy sword. To answer his first question, Elena tells him it's because the holy sword is important to her, and for the second it's because he's a high-caliber personnel. Elena reflects on how the analysis of the gemstone powder from Rebecca's necklace was so difficult that even the Royal Palace Magic Department has given up, and even Sidron is still struggling with it. If you're tired, you can lean on me, the Duke says to Elena, and immediately she rests her head on his broad shoulders. At night, they finally arrive at the Morgana Castle. Elena asks the Count if he's really okay with them excavating the holy sword, and he says yes with a reassuring smile. Then the Duke suggests that they begin with the excavation the next morning. The next day, the house is filled with so much noise, and as Elena wonders what is going on, a person announces the presence of the Crown Prince Barthas. As soon as he steps in, he tells them he'd come after hearing that the holy sword was buried there. Elena goes to greet the prince, and after realizing she's Duchess Mayhart, he asks what brings her there, and she reveals that they're also there because of the holy sword. Just to be clear, we arrived first, Elena screams at the top of her voice, leaving the prince shocked that a person would dare challenge him. Elena tells the Crown Prince they'd already obtained excavation permission from Count Morgana, so she believes they have priority for the excavation of the holy sword. She asks the prince if that isn't right, but he asks her what she's talking about, since it's only natural for the royal palace to excavate and store relics like the holy sword. But Elena asks what makes it natural and if it's designated by the law. The Crown Prince doesn't back down and argues that it is common sense for the royal palace to store the holy sword, and if common sense must be established by the law. However, Elena tells the prince that if what he considers as common sense is his thought, then she can't follow it, so he turns to the Duke and asks what he thinks about the situation. It's only right that the royal palace holds priority for the excavation rights of the holy sword under any circumstances, don't you think so? The Crown Prince says to the Duke, but the Duke responds that he always just follows his wife's opinion, leaving the Crown Prince angered. However, a person speaks up saying now's not the time. Andy tells them at that rate it seems unlikely that they'll reach a conclusion, so he suggests they leave the decision to the Count. The prince agrees and then turns to the Count and asks if he'll transfer the rights to excavation to him, the Crown Prince, but Elena speaks and reminds him not to forget that he'd granted them excavation permission the previous night. The Marquis is in a tight spot, thinking of how upsetting the royal family could end badly, but if he goes the other way he might incur the wrath of the Duke, and since his territory is close, if he retaliates it might cause significant damage. Father, a young girl calls out. The little girl tells her father she'd heard all the noise, and after he explains the situation to her, she goes to the Crown Prince and suggests there's a place called the Herman Mountain Range, adjacent to the Count's territory, and as the weather gets warmer, the monster population in the mountain increases and monsters often come down from the mountain and raid the Count's territory. Please subjugate the monsters from the Herman Mountain Range. The person who defeats the most monsters will be granted the right to excavate the sacred sword, she finishes. The Crown Prince asks her if she thinks what she's saying makes any sense, and she responds that the holy sword is a very important relic, and when approaching to excavate the sacred sword, They don't know how the barrier protecting it will respond when it's pulled out, and eliminating the monsters would also benefit their territory, but it would also serve as a way to evaluate both their strengths. Elena looks at Kiffin, who smiles at her in return, and the Crown Prince, already smelling defeat, agrees to participate on a condition that, as the opposition, Elena must participate in the extermination as well. Elena is surprised by his condition that she asks if he's telling her to go up to the mountains and hunt monsters, but he says that's right and asks if there's a problem. Elena, holding the Duke's arm, tells him it's just as he can see that she isn't in the best condition to do so, but the Crown Prince asks her if she's trying to get out of it with convenient excuses. He tells Elena she must also participate in the test to qualify for excavation rights, while Elena calls him a bastard in her head, thinking how obvious it is that the Duke will barely be able to move whilst protecting her. Elena agrees, but the Duke tells her it'll be dangerous, but she tells him it's fine. You'll protect me, right? I won't leave your side. Elena suggests they write up a contract then and there, and even though the prince isn't pleased, he doesn't want to lose face, so he orders the Count to fetch some paper and pen, and also bring ink for seal. The Duke notices Elena and whispers, "If you really need the holy sword, we could hand it over first and then steal it back," leaving Elena surprised that her husband will think of such, but she responds that his method isn't bad, but she'll save it as a last resort since she's thought of a better idea. Later, after the contract has been signed, Elena reads to the prince that according to the contract, the person who can't accept the outcome must cut off their own wrist. The little girl tells them that 2 members of their household would be assigned to them, and also the contest would proceed in pairs of 2s, and each will be given a dagger and a bag which they will use to collect the ears of the monsters they kill. Once the contest is over, the ears will be counted there, and the side with the most number of ears wins. As the Crown Prince navigates his path to the mountain, he reflects on how he'd expected it to be easy since he'd gotten the information from the temple, but the Duke and the Duchess were making things difficult. Soon the prince's knight orders the rest to stay alert, since they'll split into 2 teams to slay the monsters, but a knight calls the prince's attention to the smoke coming from the mountains. The king orders them to come with him, thinking they're trying to distract the monsters with fire. To go this far just to hunt monsters, how foolish. Just before they can reach the smoke, a monster appears, and the prince takes it down, but he's shocked as he notices the amount of monsters on the ground. Just as the Crown Prince stands in front of the flame, Elena appears in front of the Crown Prince and asks if everything is okay. After it was decided that they'd go to the mountain to subjugate the monsters, Elena had planned that at first, Andy would use his fire spirit to ignite the monster corpses, and then use the water spirit to contain the fire from spreading. Then the wind spirit will disperse the smell of the smoke as far as possible, and through the spirits, Andy would be able to see where the monsters are approaching from each time and inform Kiffin. In a new scene, Elena sips her tea thinking of how they'd won and the Crown Prince's troops had retreated more easily than expected. Kiffin tells Elena she doesn't need to be on site, and she asks if he's saying he'll leave her behind, and he says it might be dangerous, and just as Lady Morgana had mentioned, no one knows what could happen during the excavation of the sacred sword. Elena tells the Duke that was why she brought Andy, and it should be fine with just the 3 of them, but the Duke tells her staying back will be safer for her. Elena asks the Duke what place could be safer for her than by his side, and she says she's thought it over. She tells him it was her idea to excavate the sacred sword in the first place, but now she's staying in a safe space while sending him alone to a dangerous place, but the Duke calls her name and makes her a promise that he'll be all right and he'll return safely. "I'll be back soon unhurt, so please just wait a little here," the Duke says as he caresses her cheek. Andy comes to inform the Duke that it's almost time for them to depart. Elena tells him to make use of Andy since he's a spirit mage, and if things get dangerous he should hand Andy over and get out, and her eyes fill with worry as the Duke tells her he'll be back. Later, Elena sits when the Lady of House Morgana asks her why she's so intent on excavating the sacred sword. The sacred sword holds immense value simply because of its symbolism, meaning it's a relic anyone would covet, and the fact that the Count had given up on excavating the sacred sword might be due to his judgment or nature. Elena asks her if she believes there's no need to excavate the sacred sword, but she tells her that she's anxious. The forest in the Count's territory where the sacred sword was found, there was nothing there before. The barrier was completely hiding the sword's existence, she responds. But now the power of the barrier seems to have weakened and suddenly traces of the sacred sword have appeared in the world. "What if a war breaks out?" the little girl asks. I'm not talking about a war between people. She clarifies the sacred sword was created to kill things that cannot be defeated by human power. The fact that the sealed sword has emerged into this world, could it be a warning that a war is coming soon? A war that cannot be dealt with by human strength. Thinking like that makes me honestly uneasy about the sacred sword the child reveals. Elena looks at her impressed by her level of foresight and then says, "It's okay. Even if a war breaks out, we will definitely win," Elena assures her with a smile on her face. In a new scene, Elena sits by the window wondering when they'll finally arrive and if they'll arrive after one more day when she hears some noise and goes to check the window, and to her surprise she spots Kiffin, who had already returned. Elena immediately rushes to Kiffin, but he stops her, asking her not to go any closer since he's covered in the smell of monster blood. Andy tells Elena that once he'd pulled the sword, monsters began appearing from inside the barrier, and what they'd caught in the mountains was nothing compared to that. The Duke tells Elena he'd take off his outer garments, but he still smells terrible. Elena asks about his injuries, and he responds that he's fine and he doesn't have any. Elena suggests she takes a closer look, but Kiffin refuses, explaining that the stench of blood was worse than he'd thought, but Elena tells him it doesn't matter. She tries to approach the Duke, but he takes a step back, and this moment Andy sighs and says there's no need, he'll help them. He snaps his fingers, and the Duke becomes wet with the smell of monster blood no longer on him. Instantly, Elena kicks Andy's leg, demanding to know what he'd done to her husband, and he tells her he'd mentioned that he was helping. Elena goes to the Duke and apologizes for Andy's recklessness, and then goes on to ask if he's hurt anywhere. Elena stares at the Duke's face, and he asks if there's something on his face, but she just thinks, a handsome man soaked in water. Elena notices the sword in the Duke's grasp, and asks if that's the holy sword, and he responds that it has to be it since that sword was the only thing the barrier was protecting. Elena is shocked at how ordinary the sacred sword rumored to contain immense power looks when the child appears again, and says its appearance matches what she'd read in ancient texts. "Have you tried reflecting sunlight with the blade?" she asks. The Duke unsheathes the sword, and it's just as she'd said, with sunlight, they could see the writing on it, "There more." Andy asks if that's the name of the holy sword, while the child congratulates them on successfully unearthing the holy sword. Elena takes a glance at the child, and then goes to her and assures her that there's nothing to worry about. "You remember what I said, right? We will definitely win," she says as the both of them connect their pinky. In a new scene, Elena sits in a bath wondering why she couldn't stop thinking about her husband during the ride back, and it was even awkward to make eye contact. As she sits in the bathtub, she thinks about sending a letter to the Marquis's house to confirm if Andy made it back safely. Later, Elena calls for Ben and asks him what he knows about the Prince of Barthas. Ben tells Elena the Crown Prince of Barthas is the name that stirs his emotions the most intensely. Elena asks what the Crown Prince had done to him, and Ben responds that if he were to tell her everything it would take forever, but all she needed to know was that in every word and action she would sense his disdain and contempt towards her husband. Ben asks if she knows what the most ridiculous part is, and then explains that the Crown Prince harbors a deep inferiority complex towards Master Sidron. He asks Elena if she's aware that the Crown Prince's hair and eye color are rather ordinary, and she says yes. Then he explains that the Crown Prince has harbored the inferiority complex about it for a long time. Elena asks why, and Ben explains that he believes that as a crown he should be exceptional, but since he's not, he felt insecure, and then he saw Master Sidron. Elena asks what that has to do with him treating her husband poorly, and when she asks if it's because her husband is friends with Master Sidron, he says yes. Elena then asks if the Crown Prince shouldn't take it out on the Black Tower Master if he has an inferiority complex about him. Ben then explains that Elena might not have seen it firsthand, but the Master of the Black Tower isn't the one to let anyone who bothers him off easily, and Elena says, so since causing trouble with the Black Tower Master will likely have consequences, he instead tried to take it out on my husband, who seems like an easy target, and Ben says yes. In a new scene, Andy goes to a man who asks if the information he'd given him was useful at all, but he tells him that the information had leaked. He explains that the Crown Prince knows about it, and he had no idea how he found out, and the man says it seems there's a rat among the informants who was driven by greed. "Thanks, Andaden. You've made me realize that the guild needs some internal cleanup," the man says to Andy. Andy tells him it's fine because they still got the sword, but he did see something rare. "If you cross that line we marked over there, the barrier would activate. He reflects on how the Duke had looked through the thick fog and sighted the holy sword stuck in a stone, but just as he was about to pull it, a monster appeared and he'd broken the monster's neck with his bare hands, just because Elena didn't want to smell the stench. Andy tells the man he'd heard he was going to participate in the war against the other races. Andy asks if he's serious since it will be dangerous, but the man says he still has to do it regardless, because only by achieving something significant will the royal family allow him to change his surname. Andy asks if he hadn't mentioned that he wanted to change his surname to that of his late mother's, and he says yes. He tells him living as Dinan Tracis is enough now, but from then on he wants to live as Dinan Milisto. Andy tells him he sees he's had a hard time meeting a biological father like that, and everyone he took the tower exam with had their own story, but for some reason he finds himself rooting for him more than the others. The man tells him he'll gratefully accept that support without refusing, and Andy tells him he wishes he'd had an older sister or younger sister. Andy tells Dinan he'll marry her off to him, and that will be, of course, after he returns from the war against the foreign tribe. Dinan thanks Andy for thinking he's a good catch, and Andy informs him to make sure to marry a woman as good as him, and also invites him to the wedding. If you ever feel like throwing the bouquet, let me know and I'll catch it. Not sure if the groom is supposed to throw it though, Andy continues. Andy bids Dinan farewell, and then turns to leave, but Dinan calls him and asks if he hadn't mentioned that he wanted to get as strong as possible when he climbs the tower because there's someone he wants to repay. How did that go? Did you repay them? Dinan asks, but Andy just smiles and says, well, somewhat. The Holy Sword, the more according to the records, is said to be the sword used by the founding king of the empire, Rameshus I, about 1,000 years ago. He is said to have driven away the evil enemies that humanity could not withstand with the Holy Sword, but unfortunately, there were no records or evidence regarding the evil enemies he drove away, so they are only considered as legends. The empire established by Rameshus I came to an end in just over 100 years, and it was divided into several kingdoms again due to territorial disputes, and scholars believe that most records regarding the Holy Sword and other relics were lost. At night, Elena lays in bed, and she turns to find the Duke already asleep. After adjusting the blanket, Elena hopes to be able to erase the painful past of her husband, along with the scar as well. Elena wakes up to the voice of the Duke calling out to her, but her eyes widened in shock as she spots the Duke above her looking wet. Elena asks the Duke why he's so wet, and then looks around to find that she's no longer in her room but her husband's. Elena, reflecting on how she was definitely asleep in her own room, wonders if the Duke had moved her while she was asleep. Elena thinks of how she needed to do something about her husband, since he might catch a cold if he remained that way for longer. Elena? He calls out, leaning in. Is something wrong? Do you not like the way I look? Elena found herself stuttering to give a response that the Duke asks what she meant, and says he'd thought she would like him that. He asks if he wasn't right, and Elena says yes, turning away, but the Duke asks her to maintain eye contact, and as he remains settled above her, she questions if that's a dream. I can't think of anything else when I'm in front of you. Is it not the same for you? The Duke asks as he leans more forward. This time he tells her, please focus on me. The Duke tries to go in for a kiss, but she asks him to hold on and then clarifies afterwards that she isn't asking him to stop. Should I keep on wearing this outfit? She unexpectedly asks. The Duke asks Elena if it's better to take it off, while she asks if that isn't the case for everyone. The Duke begins to take off his shirt, leaving Elena with flushed cheeks as she watches the water run down his chest. You know we're not going to just kiss, right? She asks, and the Duke responds with a smile. Of course not. The Duke goes in and begins plastering kisses all over Elena's body while she closes her eyes, enjoying the sentiment, but the next time she opens it, she finds it's morning and she's in her bedroom with the Duke beside her asleep. Later, Ben goes to the Duke's office and asks if he's waiting for anyone, but he responds that it's nothing. The Duke asks Ben what is going on since he doesn't remember coming for him, and Ben tells him that it's about time for the regular subjugation mission, so he'd come to inform him, and the Duke asks him to get ready. As Ben walks down the hallway, he hears the maids gossip about how it seemed like the Duke and Duchess relationship has changed recently, since it seemed like the Duchess was avoiding the Duke. Immediately, the maids panic as they realize their mistake of gossiping about the Duke and Duchess after Ben appears in front of them. He warns them that even at the palace there are many ears listening, so they should be careful from then on. As the maids rush back to their posts, the butler thinks, I see now who you were waiting for. But the Duchess wouldn't avoid the Duke without a reason. Well, whatever reason it is, I hope it gets resolved soon. In a new scene, Elena screams in the library, unable to believe that she'd had a naughty dream. Elena tries to assure herself that it's understandable and could happen since it's just a dream of something that's normal between a couple. However, she couldn't face her husband. Just looking at his face makes the dream come back to me. I don't have the courage to look him in the eye, but I can't just tell him the truth. Just looking at him makes me want to run away in embarrassment. As Elena contemplates on whether to tell the Duke the truth, Mary comes in and informs Elena that the Duke and his knights are ready to depart since that day will be the day the Duke will lead the hunting party. Elena goes to see the Duke off, and he assures her that he'll be back soon, but as she maintains eye contact, she begins to get faint memories of the night they'd shared in her dream. The Duke spots something on her hair, and as he tries to reach for it, Elena turns away, dodging his hand, and he explains that it's just dust that's stuck, retracting his hand. I was just trying to get it off, that's all. She tells him she sees, and the Duke gets on his horse with word that he'll be back, and Elena's face fills with worry as she notices the Duke's expression. On the subjugation mission, the knights are all active slashing monsters when they notice the Duke holding his hand up, reflecting on how Elena had dodged his hand just that morning. The knights call out to the Duke continuously to call his attention to the monster behind him, telling him, "Your Grace, dodge it." Fortunately, the Duke handles the monster without even looking, which impresses the knight, but one calls them fools, asking if they thought a mere monster would be a threat to the Duke. The knight explains that under normal circumstances he would have been worried, but the Duke seemed to be in a daze. One whispers that it must be because of the lady, and they gossip between each other, trying to understand if perhaps Elena had acted that way because they were having a fight. On the other hand, the Duke tries to figure out what could have been the problem, reflecting on how he tried to be especially careful not to show the brutal killing of monsters in the mountain. He rules that out and questions, if it's not that, then what on earth could it possibly be? It wouldn't matter if someone else rejected me, but my wife must not, he says to himself as he attacks the monster behind him. The Duke makes an announcement to them that after that day's hunt is over, before returning to the castle, they will make a stop at an inn to freshen up their clothes and bodies. Later in the castle, Elena tries to understand why she'd done that, thinking the Duke must have misunderstood. Elena finally gives up and decides that when the Duke arrives, she'll have to be honest with him when Mary comes to inform her that Marquis of Morco has arrived, and Elena gasps as she realizes it's the wandering art fanatic. Mary asks what they should do since he is currently waiting at the castle gate, and she responds that she should let him into the drawing room, thinking that he doesn't have a bad reputation, so it wouldn't be bad to hear what he has to say. Elena arrives in the drawing room, and after greeting him, she reflects on how the man travels around the kingdom trading paintings without settling in one place. He tells Elena he'd come because he wanted to know who the original artist of that painting is, and after the cloth is pulled off, Elena gasps, recognizing it from somewhere. He tells her he'd purchased it recently at a shop, but he was told it was a copy. Elena turns to Mary and then asks if she could go to the studio and check if the painting she mentioned is there, and after a while she comes with a report that it's there. Elena stares intensely at the painting that the man tells her it seems she didn't know that a copy existed, and she explains that she was yet to publicly display it. Elena then asks if the person who'd sold the copy had mentioned that the original was in the possession of the Mayhart Duchess. Marquis Morco tells Elena that they did, although they were reluctant to share that information, but after pressing them for a while, they reluctantly. "Oh my, this is," Mary says, interrupting. "It must be a painting made by Bonna, right?" Mary finishes. That's it for part 2, folks. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're loving these recaps, and stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching, bye.